The soil beneath your feet already holds a fertilizer more powerful than anything sold in a garden center, and it has been used in England for over 200 years. It costs nothing to make, and most people throw its ingredients straight into the bin without a second thought. I am not going to waste your time with a long introduction, because what I am about to share with you deserves your full attention from the very first minute. I grew up in the Yorkshire Dales, in a stone farmhouse my family had worked for generations, and long before I ever heard the word fertilizer used in an advertisement, I watched my grandfather feed his lawn and his vegetable beds with things most people would consider rubbish. He was not a scientist, and he never read a gardening magazine in his life. What he knew, he had learned from his own father, standing beside him in the same fields, doing the same work, season after season. There was no chemist's shop nearby, and even if there had been, there was no money to spend in one, so the land was fed with what the land itself provided and what the household produced. Without even trying, I watched that grass grow thick and dark green every single spring, without a single bag of shop-bought feed ever touching the soil. I am sharing this now because fewer and fewer people still know how it is done, and I think that is a genuine loss. Somewhere along the way, feeding a lawn became something you had to buy rather than something you already knew how to do. Garden centers and lawn care companies built entire businesses, convincing ordinary people that grass needs a chemical formula in a plastic bottle to survive. They gave it complicated names, put it in colorful packaging, and charged a good deal of money for something that used to cost nothing at all. There was no grand conspiracy in this, only a steady, quiet shift where convenience replaced knowledge, and knowledge was slowly forgotten because it was no longer needed to get by. But what you are about to hear is not a theory, and it is not something I read somewhere and am simply repeating to you. These methods were used through hard winters and harder years, by people who had no other choice but to make their own soil feed work, and they worked then just as well as they work now. The first thing my grandfather taught me was the value of comfrey, a plant that grows wild in hedgerows and ditches across most of the English countryside. Comfrey leaves are extraordinarily rich in potassium, and potassium is exactly what grass and flowering plants need to grow strong and full. To make comfrey feed, you cut the leaves, pack them tightly into a bucket or a barrel, weight them down with a stone, and let them sit for around 4 to 6 weeks. The leaves break down into a thick, dark liquid that smells strong, and that smell is a sign that it is working, not a sign of anything gone wrong. Diluted at roughly 1 part comfrey liquid to 10 parts water. This was poured directly onto lawns and vegetable beds throughout the growing season. That is only the first method, and it is far from the most powerful one. The second involves something every household already produces every single day, and most people pour it straight down the drain without a thought. Used tea leaves and coffee grounds were never wasted in my grandmother's kitchen. Both are rich in nitrogen, which is the nutrient most responsible for that deep green color and rapid leafy growth that people spend so much money trying to achieve. Coffee grounds were left to dry slightly before being scattered thinly across the lawn. Worked gently into the top layer of soil with a rake. Tea leaves were composted first, mixed with grass clippings, and left to break down before being spread in the same way. During the Second World War, when imported fertilizers were almost impossible to find, and every scrap of food waste mattered, this kind of feeding became not just tradition, but necessity. Households were encouraged by the Ministry of Agriculture itself to return kitchen waste to the soil, because the country simply could not afford to do otherwise. Keep listening, because the third method is where most people are genuinely surprised. Wood ash, saved carefully from the fireplace after burning untreated wood, was one of the most prized soil feeds a countryside household could produce. Wood ash is rich in potassium and calcium, and it also helps balance soil that has become too acidic, which is a common problem in much of the English countryside due to heavy rainfall. My grandfather kept a metal bin beside the hearth, specifically for cooled ash, and once it had fully cooled, usually after a full day, it was scattered thinly across the lawn, never in thick clumps, because too much at once could do more harm than good. A light dusting, worked lightly into the surface with the back of a rake, was enough to feed a reasonable-sized lawn for several weeks. This was done perhaps once a month through the colder part of the year, when fires were burning regularly anyway. Now, here is the part that surprises almost everyone who hears it for the first time, and it is where the real transformation happens. Grass clippings, left where they fall after mowing rather than collected and thrown away, return a remarkable amount of nutrients directly back into the soil. This practice has a name in modern terms, but in the countryside it was simply called leaving the land alone to feed itself. As the clippings break down, they release nitrogen slowly and steadily, feeding the roots, exactly as they need it, without the sudden burst and equally sudden fade that shop-bought feeds often produce. The trick my grandfather always insisted on was mowing little and often, never letting the grass grow too long before cutting, because short, fine clippings break down far faster than long, thick ones. Combined with the comfrey feed and the tea leaves, this created a steady, layered cycle of nourishment that kept the lawn thick and dark through most of the growing season. But that is still not the final piece, and the fifth method is the one most people have never even heard of. Eggshells, crushed finely and worked into the soil, release calcium slowly over many weeks, strengthening plant cell walls and helping grass resist the kind of stress that turns patches yellow and thin. In my grandmother's kitchen, eggshells were dried on the windowsill, then crushed by hand or with a rolling pin until they were almost a powder. This powder was scattered across bare or thinning patches of lawn. Spring, when new growth was just beginning to push through. It was a slow feed, not a fast one, but slow feeding is exactly what builds soil that lasts, rather than soil that needs constant topping up. The sixth and final method ties everything else together, and it is the one my grandfather considered the most important of all. Diluted urine, difficult as it may be for some people to hear, was used across the English countryside for centuries as a nitrogen-rich feed for both lawns and vegetable gardens. It sounds unusual to modern ears, but it was ordinary practice for generations who understood that nothing useful should ever go to waste. Diluted at roughly 1 part to 15 parts water and applied directly to the soil rather than onto the grass blades themselves. It delivered a strong, fast-acting dose of nitrogen that produced visibly greener growth within days. This was never spoken of as anything unusual in its time, simply as one more resource the household already had put to sensible use. When these 6 methods were used together, rotated through the seasons rather than applied all at once, the result was a lawn that stayed thick, dark, and resilient without a single penny spent at a garden center. I think about this often, and what strikes me most is not the methods themselves, but how easily they were set aside. None of what I have shared with you today required money, a car journey to a shop, or a subscription to anything at all. It required only attention, patience, and a willingness to see value in things most people now consider waste. That, to me, is the real loss, not the knowledge itself, because the knowledge was never truly gone, only quietly forgotten by people who no longer needed to remember it to get by. Anyone willing to spend a season paying attention can reclaim it, exactly as it was practiced by people who had nothing else to rely on. If this has been useful to you, there are a great many more methods where this one came from. I share a new one every day, drawn from the same countryside traditions that raised me. The old ways are still here, quietly waiting. You simply have to know where to look.